Welcome to the deep dive. Ready to explore globalization?
Always.
Well, today we're going way back.
Further than you think.
Yeah, I bet most people think, oh, globalization is like, the internet and stuff.
With the last 50 years or so.
Exactly. But really, the roots go way deeper.
Millennia, actually.
Millennia. So like before cars and planes and all that.
Long before. We're talking ancient civilizations.
Wow. Okay, so like what? Give me an example.
Imagine the Indus Valley civilization.
Oh, yeah, in India, right.
That's the one. So it's 3000 BCE, and these folks weren't isolated.
They weren't.
Nope. They had a whole coastal trade network going with West Asia.
3000 BCE, and they're already trading internationally.
It's pretty amazing.
That really blows my mind. And it's not just like, pottery and spices.
Right. It's so much more.
I was reading about these cowrie shells from the Maldives.
Oh, yeah, the cowrie shells.
Used as currency in China and East Africa.
For over 1,000 years.
A tiny seashell connecting economies across continents.
It's incredible, isn't it? And it really highlights that these exchanges weren't just about goods and money.
So what else?
Values, skills, ideas, inventions.
Of course.
Diseases, unfortunate.
You can't forget that part.
Even back in the 7th century,
The 7th century.
disease-carrying germs were already spreading far and wide.
Wow, interconnectedness with some serious downsides, huh?
Definitely a double-edged sword.
Makes you think. Okay, so speaking of impactful exchanges, what about the Silk Roads?
Ah, the Silk Roads.
I mean, everyone's heard of them.
Right, but there's a lot more to the story than just, fancy silk.
Okay, I'm all ears.
We need to think about the Silk Roads as
Yeah.
this massive network
Let's
of
go.
both land and sea routes.
Both. So it's not just like caravans through the desert.
Not at all. And this was all going on centuries before the Christian era.
Okay, so long before Europe was even a major player.
Exactly. These routes, they were the lifeline of the ancient world.
So what were some of the goods traveling these routes?
Well, going west, you had Chinese silk, of course,
Beautiful stuff.
and amazing pottery, too.
Oh, yeah, I've seen some of those ancient pieces in museums.
Incredible, right?
Exactly.
Then, heading east, you had textiles and spices
Ooh, spices, yum.
from India and Southeast Asia.
A real mix of luxury goods.
Oh, and don't forget gold and silver from Europe.
Okay, so this is big business.
Definitely fueled a lot economies.
And connected cultures, I bet.
Big time. Think about it. The spread of Buddhism from India along these routes.
Really?
Huge impact.
That's incredible.
And Christian and Muslim missionaries, too, traveling all over.
So the Silk Roads weren't just trade routes,
They were like cultural highways.
shaping ideas and beliefs.
Absolutely. Leaving a lasting mark on the world.
All this talk of ancient trade routes and goods, it makes me think of food.
Oh, food is a great way to understand cultural exchange.
Totally. It's something everyone can relate to, right?
For sure, everyone eats.
I was reading about this whole mystery surrounding noodles.
Oh, yeah, the noodle mystery.
It's fascinating. Did they come from China and eventually become spaghetti?
It's possible.
Or did Arab traders bring pasta to Sicily in the 5th century?
Another good theory.
And then you've got similar noodles in India and Japan.
It's a real puzzle.
Maybe we'll never know the answer.
Maybe not. But it shows how our culinary world has been connected for centuries.
That's for sure. Okay, so speaking of culinary adventures, we can't forget about the Columbian Exchange,
Ah, yes, the discovery of the Americas.
bringing a whole new menu to the table.
Literally. Imagine a world without potatoes or tomatoes.
Or chili peppers.
Mm.
Or chocolate.
All those things came from the Americas.
It's mind-blowing to think about Europe before potatoes.
It's a game changer for sure.
Huge impact on diets and populations.
Absolutely. The potato, for example,
Yeah,
became a staple crop in Europe.
and led to...
Big population growth.
Right, but then there's the Irish potato famine of the 1840s.
True, the blight
Devastating.
shows the danger of relying too much on one crop.
A real cautionary tale, even with these seemingly positive developments.
You always have to look at the bigger picture.
Okay, so it seems like the 16th century, with the sea route to Asia and exploring the Americas, that was a turning point.
Oh, yeah, the world shrunk, in a sense.
Shrunk.
I mean, it became more connected, more accessible.
Driven by European exploration
A quest for new trade routes and resources.
and the Indian subcontinent.
Oh, absolutely.
It became like a hub.
Connecting different parts of the world.
But this increased connection, it came at a cost, right?
Sadly, yes. We can't ignore the darker side.
You're talking about conquest
Sure.
and the spread of disease.
Exactly.
The European conquest of the Americas.
Tragic consequences for indigenous populations.
Fueled by...
Thirst for gold and land.
And disease played a role, too, right?
A huge role. Smallpox, for example.
Brought over by European.
Decimated indigenous population.
They had no immunity.
None at all.
A truly heartbreaking chapter.
And this ties into another dark chapter, the Atlantic slave trade.
Oh, yeah, can't forget about that.
Demand for labor on plantations.
Producing sugar and cotton for Europe.
Right. It fueled the transatlantic slave trade.
Horrific.
A reminder that the growth of global trade often intertwined with immense suffering.
So much to think about.
It's important to acknowledge these complexities.
All right, so moving into the 19th century.
Things really start to accelerate then.
I bet.
A whirlwind of change, economic, political, social, cultural, technological.
The world was transformed.
Reshaping global relationships for good.
And at the heart of it all?
3 key flows.
Hit me with them.
Trade and goods.
Okay, that makes sense.
Labor migration.
People on the move.
And the movement of capital.
Money makes the world go round, right?
As they say.
These 3 flows, all tangled up, shaping millions of lives.
A truly global story starting to unfold. So to really get a sense of how interconnected everything was becoming, let's look at Britain's hunger in the 19th century.
Britain's hunger.
Yeah, their need for food.
Okay, I'm listening.
With the Industrial Revolution in full swing and the population booming, Britain needed a lot more food grains than they could actually grow themselves.
So what do? Rationing.
Well, first they try to protect their own agriculture.
Makes sense.
They passed these laws called the Corn Laws.
Corn laws, huh?
Designed to restrict corn imports, keep prices high for British farmers.
Sounds like a good idea. Protect your own.
It backfired, though.
How so?
Food prices got so high it led to social unrest.
People gotta eat.
Exactly. So there was pressure to abolish those corn laws.
Do.
Industrialists and, of course, people in the cities who needed cheaper food.
Right, makes sense.
So the corn laws were abolished, and suddenly cheaper imports were flooding in.
Okay, but cheaper imports, that means British farmers are struggling, right?
So they couldn't compete.
So what happened?
Land was left uncultivated, workers displaced, migration increased.
Oh, ripple effect.
But it wasn't just a local story.
It wasn't.
Nope. To meet this British demand, lands were being cleared all over the world.
Where?
Eastern Europe, Russia, America, Australia.
Wow, so Britain's hunger was shaping landscapes across the globe.
Exactly. And it wasn't just about the food itself. This trade needed infrastructure.
Like what?
Railways, harbors, all to get that grain moving.
So we're seeing the development of global infrastructure, too.
Absolutely. And capital flowing from London, financing it all.
Money talks.
And then you have people migrating to America and Australia to meet the labor demand.
So a decision in Britain is setting off a chain reaction across continents.
It's a classic example of how interconnected things are becoming.
But, I have a feeling this interconnectedness wasn't always a good thing, was it?
You're right. It could amplify existing inequalities.
How so?
Take the story of Rinderpest, for example.
Rinderpest, that sounds ominous.
It was a cattle plague. In the 1890s, swept through Africa.
How bad was it?
Killed something like 90% of the cattle.
90%? That's devastating.
It was a real tragedy, and it highlights the impact of European colonialism.
Okay, but how does a cattle plague in Africa connect to globalization?
It all started with infected cattle.
Infected?
Brought in from British Asia.
To Africa? Why?
To feed Italian soldiers in Eritrea.
So, this seemingly small action
had catastrophic consequences.
Wow.
The disease spread like wildfire across the continent.
Wiping out livelihoods and economies.
Exactly.
And this created labor shortages, didn't it?
It did, for European plantations and mines.
So they took advantage of the situation.
They did. They used this crisis to control resources.
And force Africans into the labor market.
Sadly, yes.
A real dark side to this interconnectedness.
It's important to remember these consequences.
Absolutely. Can't forget that part of story. Okay, so speaking of exploitation, what about indentured labor migration from India?
Another complex aspect of globalization.
Right, like the flip side of the coin.
You could say that.
Yeah.
On one hand, economic potential. On the other, immense suffering.
Because hundreds of thousands of people were recruited.
Indians and Chinese labor.
Knowing where?
All over the Caribbean, Mauritius, Fiji, South Africa, Southeast Asia.
Cool.
Plantations, mines, infrastructure projects.
Building the world.
But often under false pretenses.
Lured by promises of a better life.
Many came from regions struggling with economic hardship.
Back in India,
Yeah, declining industries, rising land rents, displacement.
desperate for a way out.
Exactly, and agents exploited that desperation.
So they ended up in these faraway places.
And the reality was far from what they were promised.
What was life like for them?
Brutal, harsh conditions, few rights.
Essentially slaves in a new system.
Some historians argue that
It's hard to hear these stories, but important to remember.
absolutely, it's part of understanding the full picture of globalization.
Okay, but even in these awful conditions, didn't some people find ways to resist, adapt,
They did. Some escaped. Others found solace in their traditions.
blending those traditions with new influences?
Exactly. It led to some amazing cultural fusion.
Like what?
Think about the José Carnival in Trinidad.
I've heard of that, but I don't know much about it.
It evolved from the Muharram procession,
Really?
or Rastafarianism in Jamaica.
That's a blend of Christianity and African traditions, right?
Right on.
Amazing how people find ways to connect and create, even in the face of adversity.
Shows the resilience of the human spirit.
It also challenges the idea that globalization is a one-way street.
Right, it's an interplay of cultures, a give and take.
And it wasn't just the laborers who were shaping this global story, right?
No, Indian financiers played a role too.
Financiers.
Think of bankers and traders.
Okay, like who?
Groups like the Shikarpuri Shroffs and the Natu Kotai Chettiars.
Those are some complicated names.
I know, right? But these were savvy businessmen.
What do they do?
Financed export agriculture in Central and Southeast Asia.
So they were supporting the global trade in food.
Exactly. They used their own funds, borrowed from European banks, developed sophisticated systems.
It's fascinating to think about these Indian financiers operating on a global scale.
Challenging the idea that it was all driven by Europe.
Absolutely. So, as we move into the 20th century,
We enter a new era, even more complex.
with war, upheaval, new ideologies,
The world was on the brink of major change again.
World War I, even though it's mainly in Europe,
Had a huge impact on the global economy.
disrupted everything, I imagine.
Trade networks, massive debt, shifted the balance of power.
Created a boom during the war.
It did. Countries needed to produce for the war effort. The hangover,
aftermath.
production contracts, unemployment soars, government scrambling.
Not to mention the agricultural crisis.
Oh, yeah, that was a mess too.
What happened?
Well, during the war, Eastern Europe's wheat production was disrupted.
Okay.
So other places stepped up.
Like Canada, the U.S., Australia.
Exactly. But when Eastern Europe recovered, suddenly there was too much wheat.
Supply and demand, the classic problem.
Prices plummeted. Farmers who had borrowed heavily were in trouble.
A boom and bust cycle, but on a global scale.
Exactly. And this is setting the stage for
It's a Great Depression.
the big one.
But meanwhile, wasn't the U.S. doing pretty well?
They emerged from the war as a creditor nation.
Lent a lot of money to Europe, right?
Loads of it. And they were experiencing a technological boom.
The Roaring '20s.
Mass production, Henry Ford's assembly line, goods becoming more affordable,
Fueling a consumer boom.
driving economic growth.
But it couldn't last forever, could it?
No, it was a house of cards.
About to collapse.
Into the Great Depression.
The Great Depression, one of those moments that changed everything.
And it did. A global economic catastrophe.
What were the main ingredients in this recipe for disaster?
Well, agricultural overproduction was a big one.
So-
Farmers kept producing more, trying to make up for falling prices.
Which just made things worse.
Exactly. A vicious cycle.
And then there were those U.S. loans.
Oh, yeah. Many countries depended on them for their recovery.
So when the U.S. economy started to wobble,
Panic. Lenders wanted their money back.
global domino effect.
Bank failures, currency collapses, trade plummets.
The world in free fall.
Pretty much.
And India, I bet they felt it too.
Oh, they did. Big time. They were a major exporter of agricultural goods.
An importer of manufactured goods.
So when trade declined,
Ouch.
exports and imports nearly halved between 1928 and 1934.
That's a huge drop.
Wheat prices plummeted by 50%.
So this global crisis
Deepened existing inequalities within India.
made the rich richer and the poor poorer,
You could say that. The British government didn't reduce their demands on Indian farmers.
even though prices were collapsing.
Exactly. It was an impossible burden. Many were already in debt.
Social unrest brewing,
A recipe for nationalist movements to take root.
the Great Depression, a turning point in history, exposing the cracks in the system.
It showed the world that the old ways weren't working.
So what happened next? How did the world pick up the pieces?
Well, those lessons from the Great Depression, they shaped the post-World War II economic order.
New institutions, new ways of thinking.
A whole new chapter in the story of globalization.
Sounds like we're heading into uncharted territory.
We are. The world is about to change again.
So last time we talked about the Great Depression, a global catastrophe. What happened after that? How did the world recover from this massive economic crisis?
Well, the Second World War happened, reshaping everything, and after that, the world had to rebuild again.
And with two new superpowers on the scene, the United States and the Soviet Union, how did global leaders even begin to approach rebuilding the world economy, especially after such a devastating conflict?
Well, they had learned some hard lessons from the Great Depression.
Like what?
That relying solely on markets to regulate the economy could be disastrous.
Yeah, the 1930s were a pretty good example of that.
Exactly. They realized that government intervention was key.
To ensure economic stability.
Right. And to create jobs, full employment.
So a shift away from just letting the markets do their thing.
Definitely. They understood that controlling the flow of goods, capital, and labor was super important for stability.
So they needed a whole new system, new rules, new institutions.
Exactly. And that's where the Bretton Woods Agreement comes in.
Bretton Woods, that rings a bell.
In 1944, representatives from 44 allied nations met in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire.
To basically redesign the global financial system.
Pretty much. It was a huge moment.
So what did they come up with?
Well, they created the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank.
Those are still around today, right? So they must have done something right.
Yeah, they were designed to be the pillars of the post-war economic order.
What did each institution actually do? How did they contribute to rebuilding the global economy?
The IMF focused on helping countries manage their balance of payments and exchange rates.
Preventing those currency crises that can wreak havoc.
Exactly. The World Bank, on the other hand, was initially all about financing reconstruction after the war.
Rebuilding all those bombed-out cities and infrastructure.
Yep. Later on, it shifted to development projects in poorer countries.
So these Bretton Woods twins, as some people call them, were meant to prevent another Great Depression.
That was the goal: promote international financial cooperation and stability.
And it sounds like they did a pretty good job, for a while at least. I mean, the post-war period saw a lot of economic growth.
It did for the Western industrial nations, and Japan at least. World trade exploded, incomes rose. It seemed like a golden age.
But it wasn't a golden age for everyone, was it?
Unfortunately not. Many developing countries, just getting their independence from colonial rule, still faced huge challenges.
Poverty, lack of resources, the lasting effects of colonialism.
Exactly. They felt like the Bretton Woods system, while creating stability, wasn't really addressing their needs.
It's almost like this system reinforced those global inequalities instead of solving them.
It's a valid point. These newly independent nations were still often dependent on their former colonial powers or on multinational corporations.
So they didn't have much control over their own destinies.
Not really. So they formed a group, the Group of 77, or G77.
The G77, I've heard of that. What did they want?
They called for a new international economic order, or NIEO.
A more just and equitable system, basically.
That's it. They wanted control over their own resources, more development assistance, fairer prices for their raw materials, and better access to markets for their manufactured goods.
Sounds pretty reasonable.
It was, but the Bretton Woods system, well, it wasn't really designed for that.
It was a product of its time.
Exactly. And by the 1970s, it was starting to unravel.
What happened? Why did it fall apart?
A few reasons. The U.S., facing economic woes and the Vietnam War, couldn't keep the dollar pegged to gold anymore.
That was a key part of the Bretton Woods system, wasn't it?
It was. So when that went, the whole system basically collapsed. We moved to a floating exchange rate system.
So the era of Bretton Woods ended, ushering in a new phase of globalization.
One that was more market-driven, more volatile, with developing countries relying more on loans from Western banks and the rise of global manufacturing in places like China.
Wow, what a journey. From ancient trade routes to the complexities of the modern global economy, it's been quite a deep dive. What are some of the key takeaways you'd leave our listeners with today?
I think it's crucial to remember that globalization is not a new thing. It's been happening for centuries, shaped by human choices, technology, and power dynamics. And it's a force with both opportunities and challenges.
It's connected the world in incredible ways, but also created inequalities and exploitation.
Right. It's not inevitable, though. We have the power to shape it, to make it more inclusive, more sustainable.
So as we navigate this interconnected world, What can we do to make it a more just and equitable place?
We need to be aware of our impact, our choices, and work towards a globalization that benefits everyone, not just a few.
A powerful message to end on. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the history of globalization. We've only scratched the surface, but hopefully it's sparked your curiosity to learn more.